Hello, everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with One Nation Under Whiskey podcast. I'm joined, as always, by my good friend, my business partner, the man voted most likely to be eclipsed by the moon, Mr. Jason Neil Patrick Harris Johnston Yellen.
That's interesting that I'm eclipsed by the moon. I know I'm whiter than the moon, but that would then make me the sun.
When you're more like Uranus.
Okay, get the low-hanging fruit out of the way right away. First 5 seconds.
Yeah, I feel that was almost too low-hanging. I think I picked it up off the ground. It was rotting. Had some
I'd already
maggots in
fallen
it.
off the tree and rotted, and you still picked it up.
Here it is, guys. Guys, here's that terrible joke. Okay, I'll put it down.
But anyway, hello.
Hello. How are you?
All right. Recording this on a very Scottish day in rural Virginia.
Okay.
It is very cloudy. It is very damp. Our high temperature is not very high at all. So need to be pouring some drams here. So
Would you call that dreich?
very much so. I would 100% call it dreich. Miserable.
All right. So,
yeah, one of those days that really gets in your bones.
So what would you do on a day like that? Because you said it, right? You said this is dram pouring weather. Would you pour a whiskey that would warm the cockles, or would you pour a whiskey that would make you think of summertime?
Oh no!
Instead.
No, that's a fool's errand in Scotland. No, you're not pouring something that makes you go. When the summer comes, it's going to be a great day. Oh, we're going to enjoy it so much. No, we would. It's interesting. I've never really poured whiskey in response to the weather in Scotland, mostly because
You didn't have to
being
pour
a
it. It was
West-
already in there.
Yeah, being a West Coast boy, it's what you get today is really what you're going to get tomorrow, which is what you're going to get next week and probably the week after. And it's just going to be real mild, verging on cold, cloudy, rainy. You just try to ignore the weather as best you can.
So as a West Coast boy, grew up in Ayrshire. In Ayr?
Yeah.
I know Maybole was part of it as well.
Yeah, I left Ayr when I was 10 and then lived in the Carrick Hills and Maybole. But Ayrshire my whole life until I went to University of Aberdeen.
So that's southwest. Is the southwestern weather similar to where our guest Annabel Thomas, where Nc'nean's distillery is? Is it similar weather? It's
100%.
just pure shit coming and going?
100%. Yep, that west coast of Scotland just gets the same weather systems. I was reading in Mike Billett's book this morning. What is it, Pete and Whisky? Put onto that book by Anna Hinz at Westland.
Ah, there you go.
Thank you to Anna for the recommendation. And he was just talking about Mull, the Isle of Mull, being one of Scotland's wettest spots. And which, talk about a competition you don't want to win, but also talk about a competition that has incredible competition amongst the participants. I was like, yeah, there's Mull, there's the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. There's go a little farther north than Ardnamurchan Distillery, and you're gonna get to Nc'nean, right? It's all much of a muchness. Yeah, real tough, real wet. Oh, geez, now we're talking about this Scottish weather as I'm looking out my window at this Scottish weather. What a downer! Gosh, no, I say it to people all the time. Often as an Ayrshire boy who lives abroad, I often think to myself, will there come a time when I move home? Will I relocate? And I could not do it. I just couldn't. I need the sunny days. I need the blue sky. I love the sunny days and the blue sky too much.
Yeah.
It's a bit shallow to say I wouldn't move home because of the weather, but the truth of the matter, dear listener, is I could not move home because of the weather.
The number of Scottish people who've just driven off the side of the road after hearing that. They've
that's 'cause the rain was
their
hitting.
kilt.
The rain was hitting their windscreen so hard they couldn't see and went off into a ditch. Yeah, tough sledding. But that's an interesting question about would you pour whiskey in response to the weather, and would that either help you to, would it warm the cockles, or would it have you think about the summer? Yeah, there is clearly the romance of sitting down next to a fire in a secure, warm room and pouring something, or maybe sharing something, and it really is, and that's very much the sense of growing up in Ayrshire. There's what happens, and I know where your mind is going to take this, Joshua, but there's what happens when you get in from the cold and you close the door behind you and you close the curtains and you put on the fire.
Jeez, when you start describing it that way, keep going.
You
The
light
next
some
step
candles.
is okay.
You
all
open
right.
a bottle of wine.
Hold on. I'm starting to get all hot under the collar here. Starting to get the vapors.
And that's the goal of it all, right? That's the way you heat yourself. So no, and then in the royal family tradition, royal ROYLE, not ROYAL.
Right.
In the royal family tradition, you gather round the telly and you send the youngest off to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. Are you familiar with that show? Absolute British institution.
I've got no idea. When you said royal and you put an E at the end, I was almost hoping you were going to ask because I was feeling too dumb to ask the question. I didn't want to reveal how dumb I was, but here we are. I'm dumb. What is this show?
Well, what was your song, John? Smooth John B. What's the Beach Boys?
Sloop John B.
Sloop John B. Right? You make references like that, and I'm like, nope, no idea what the hell you're talking about.
True.
So
That's true. Okay.
only fair to have a little cultural exchange with the royal family. No, well worth checking out. I think Prime, actually. Amazon Prime had it for a while.
So how old a show are we talking?
Maybe the very turn of the 21st century.
Oh, okay. So
Maybe I don't think it was the 90s.
Was it like the
last
British
word.
Friends?
Turns out it was the 90s. I'm saying again, sir?
was it like the British Friends or something?
No, sir. Coupling was like the British Friends.
Ah, okay.
And coupling is available on Roku TV in America. I sometimes
I've heard of
dabble.
that show. Yeah.
The royal family in various incarnations ran from 1998 to 2012, with its first 3 seasons, which were the focus, 1998 to 2000.
Okay. And you'll say I'll enjoy it.
It speaks to a particular sensibility that you may or may not grasp. Like, on one hand, and again, I don't want to go too deep into this, but on one hand, it's about a British family who sits around their living room watching the telly. That is what it's about.
Oh.
Any global family who gathers and watches telly together.
Yeah.
The problem, to my mind, is for younger folk aren't sitting around the telly with their family, and there's only one channel being watched at a time. And you watch what mum and dad want to watch, and maybe once a week you get your program on the telly, right? Young people have no idea what we're talking about in that realm.
Yeah.
This show is very much that. So for an old man like yourself, it may resonate. For much younger listeners, perhaps not.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's highlighting really a bygone era. I mean, that's just not how families commune with one another anymore at all. which I think, in a very tenuous, very tortured manner, talks to our guest today, Annabel Thomas and the Nc'nean Distillery, who are...
I know exactly where you're taking this. I think this is quite clever, Joshua, and I don't, as you know, say that every day.
Wow. Well, thank you. Listen, I will take that compliment, and I'll take that fucking compliment to the grave. But
Get on a t-shirt.
But here's the thing, and you know, our listeners will hear it from Annabel herself, but it really, for them, it's how they lead their conversation with their production methods, with an eye on sustainability, with an eye on being green and net carbon neutral and organic, and how they power the plant, and how they bring all of the elements in, and how they ship them back out. You know, there's so many points to their production that really support this aim of theirs to say, hey, everybody, we are this green plant that are focused primarily on the earth first. We're also going to make great whiskey, but we're focused primarily
that's
on...
important.
Right? And that's the thing, right? I mean, she may have mentioned it in the interview. I don't quite remember. But I know she's mentioned it in seminars before where she's talking about, you know, all of the ins and outs of production and, you know, the things they've put in place to ensure they're being kind to the earth. She said, all that's well and good, but if our whiskey isn't great whiskey, then it's all for naught, right? So, you know, it's ensuring they're making good whiskey while doing all of these good things. And you know, rather than have me call them all out, why don't we just pass the mics over to me and to Annabel, and we can hear it from her mouth straight. Annabel Thomas, thank you so much for joining me. Here we are, we're in New York City.
We are.
At the Civilian with George Michael in the background, giving us the faith that we need to have this whiskey conversation. Firstly, thank you for coming on.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Before we have a whiskey conversation, I want to talk about you a little bit, because my general understanding from our time together is that you didn't come from whiskey. You sort of kind of like me, or at least the way that I talk about my adventure into whiskey is that I weaseled my way in. Would you say you've weaseled your way into whiskey, or how did you get into it?
I think I kind of jumped in.
All right.
But without necessarily knowing where I was jumping to.
Okay.
Because it was quite an abrupt thing.
Okay.
I used to work for Bain & Company, which is a strategy consulting firm, very corporate-y job, advising big companies on strategy things. Very varied, very cool, very hard work.
Okay. Satisfying work?
Not really, because you would make recommendations, but you would never know what happened to them, really.
Oh.
Or influence whether they were implemented, because you're writing a recommendation or a report. You're not doing the change.
Yeah.
But also, it sort of lacked any broader purpose, which was a kind of bigger picture problem, I guess.
Yeah.
And you get very limited ability to choose which clients you work for and so on and so forth. But I decided to leave there to set up the distillery. So it was like binary. One day I was a strategy consultant, the next day I was setting up a whiskey distillery.
So, but there had to be something in between, right? In other words, like what led you to that decision of, okay, I'm done with Bain, I want to get into the whiskey business? Yeah,
and that was quite a long process. So Nc'nean is right up on the west coast of Scotland on my family farm. And we had been talking about a whiskey distillery there for a while. It was originally my dad's idea. There's whiskey distilleries all around us. I think you can't be on the west coast of Scotland and not think about whiskey. And in 2012, I'd taken some time off from Bain, and I'd done some research, been to visit distilleries, and that was when I started to get really excited about what Nc'nean could become.
Okay.
So I did quite a lot of work on it before I left Bain. I'd
Okay.
written a preliminary business plan. We'd started talking to some investors, but very low key and not very successfully.
Okay.
And it became clear through that process that it was going to be quite hard work to set up a distillery. And that one of us, either my dad or I, need to focus on it full time. And
Yeah.
at the same time, and kind of in parallel, but totally independently, I was thinking about what next after Bain. I kind of felt like my time there had been amazing, but had probably run its course. And then these two things kind of collided.
Okay.
And it became clear that we were wasting our time trying to set up a distillery at the weekends. And I also wanted to leave Bain, and a few of the jobs I'd applied for kind of had proved quite disappointing when I'd got closer to them, and I'd thought, when am I going to get a chance to set up a distillery again?
Yeah.
And I jumped.
Okay. And so, had you gone around? I think you mentioned it. You visited some distilleries. Were there certain distilleries that? Is when I think about Nc'nean, and you'll talk about it in a little bit, really how different you are from nearly every other distillery. Were there certain distilleries in particular that, that were a bit of a guiding light for you?
Yeah, there were. And I guess I did do a lot of research, especially when I took the sabbatical from Bain. And I felt like a lot of the distilleries in Scotland were very traditional, and that's definitely not a bad thing, but I felt like there wasn't the kind of balancing force of modern distilleries or forward-looking distilleries. I think the one at the time in Scotland, so this was 2012, Bruichladdich really stood out as having, as being brave enough to do things differently, to look different, to talk about things in a different way. Even if, maybe not everything they did was right, or I don't agree with everything, they were at least making the effort to stand out.
Yeah.
But I think at the same time, there were starting to be those really notable world whiskies, and they were doing things in a different way naturally. Cavalan being a good example, for example, it's pretty cool. Whiskey from Taiwan making a splash in the UK market.
Yeah.
And that at least gave me other things to look to and confidence that doing things differently could work.
And so it wasn't necessarily their distilling practices, it was more their outreach to the consumer, or
I think
something else?
What that was inspiring, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was, in particular in Bruichladdich case, it was just, I felt like they were putting their heads above the parapet. And not conforming. Even at the time, now they're very focused on sustainability. They didn't focus at all on sustainability at the time, and I definitely felt there was a complete lack of anybody doing that or talking about it in the industry. But they were at least, they had a bright blue bottle that didn't look like any other Scotch bottle.
Yeah, exactly. The blue and exactly. Yeah. Okay. And so what time frame are we looking at? Because you incorporated in 2013.
Yeah, exactly.
So when did all this come about?
So I took the sabbatical in late 2012 and wrote this outline business plan and went to all these distilleries and realised they were all saying we're doing things the way they've always been done. And then we worked on it in early 2013, and by May 2013 we actually missed quite a big government grant deadline. Okay. And I was like, oh dear.
Oh wow. Okay.
So that was when I decided to leave Bain. I left in 2013, July, and started working on it kind of more full time then.
Okay. And so, as someone who built a business plan and had to seek capital, how much of your plan and vision do investors need to see before they say, okay, that's interesting? Like, do they want to see the plans that come from foresights for your kit, and all that, like?
No, thankfully.
Okay.
I would say generally it depends on the investor. Some people are super detailed, some people are not. I would say that at the stage of a whiskey distillery that we were raising money at, i.e., if you've got nothing physical, you've got no product, you've just got pieces of paper,
Yeah.
and you can have loads of pieces of paper or not that many pieces of paper. I would say we probably had too many. Well, we had more pieces of paper to show than anyone was interested in looking at.
Yeah.
I think ultimately most investors say, gut reaction, do I believe in the overall concept? And gut reaction, do I think that the person or people sitting in front of me can execute on this concept?
Oh, okay.
And do the numbers roughly hang together? Now, so some important parts of that in our situation, for example, is that we had Jim Swan on board.
Yeah.
And he gave the reassurance, because there was no way I could blag that,
Sure.
that we actually knew how to make, we as a team would know how to make great whiskey.
Yeah.
But, you know, we had this enormous business model, like an Excel financial model, and we had it due diligenced, for example, by an accounting firm, which cost, it felt like a lot of money at the time. It probably wasn't, but I think that was a total irrelevance to all investors.
Oh, wow.
I think most people going into a whiskey distillery at that early stage with relatively few other distilleries in the mix, you know, so there weren't that many to learn from who'd started from scratch, except that whatever numbers you put down are probably not
Oh, okay.
100%
They
accurate.
assume you have the number part of it correct.
No, I think they assume it's not correct.
Oh, they assume it's not.
I think they assume it's not correct.
Yeah.
But because most of these investors have invested in lots of early stage businesses, it's not a whiskey only thing. Most
Yeah.
early stage businesses don't get their numbers correct.
Yeah.
Especially in whiskey when there's a lot of uncertainty at the beginning. I mean, you're doing an enormous building project for a start. Everyone knows that building projects are tricky creatures.
Okay, so you're putting yourself in front of investors. What's your success rate?
Very low. I think the list of investors that we approached is 850, and
Okay.
we've ended up with 45. So that's pretty bad. Well, I don't think it's bad. I think it's probably normal, but it makes it a tough process.
So was it that number because people have a difficult time understanding that investment in a whiskey company is very much a long game, because it is?
Yeah.
Or maybe is it because your approach to it is so vastly different from what has been traditional?
No, I think at the time it was all. Well, I think the main issue was the whiskey bit. So it was the fact that it requires massive upfront capital and a very long time to even get to revenue.
Yeah.
And for a kind of a more generalist high net worth individual, for example, or even a small fund. In contrast, they're looking at, say, food products, where you can make a prototype in your kitchen, you can test it with some people, you can then make more prototypes and you can take to a festival and test it more.
Yeah.
And then you can scale up in a small factory, and then you can move to a bigger factory and scale up. And you can at least imagine there might be some beautiful hockey stick growth curve where in 3 years' time you're all billionaires. You can't imagine that out of a whiskey distillery. So I think that was a big, for some of the investors we were approaching, which was kind of the world I came from, kind of small food startups. They just couldn't get their head around the financial profile of the business. I think the second thing was that now, at least in the UK, sustainability investing is where it's all at. There are funds set up to invest in green businesses. A lot of funds, even if they're not green specific, will have green like criteria that they need to invest against, which we would have nailed every single one of. But these funds just didn't exist at the time.
Okay, so so that's now, but back then that didn't. Okay,
exactly. And we had lots of investors saying, well, the return on investment on this sustainability investment you're making within the overall business plan doesn't make sense. You shouldn't do it, and they just didn't get it.
Okay.
So I think, but on the other hand, the fact that we were doing something different is also what convinced some investors over the line.
Oh, okay.
Definitely.
Okay.
Because I think otherwise the argument would be, well, it's a really crowded market. How are you going to make a success of it?
Do you think having Jim Swan in your back pocket was a way to say, look, we have someone who actually knows how to make this stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah.
He was totally essential. I mean, we could have followed none of his advice and he still would have been essential because he gave people confidence that we could make something delicious.
Exactly.
Because what's the point in being Scotland's greenest distillery if your whiskey tastes like crap?
So here you are, right? You're Scotland's greenest distillery. And I feel, you know, being with you back in October and then being with you now these past few days, it's clear that you absolutely believe in what you're doing. You're trying to lead by example. I always get nervous when larger companies do things like this, and it seems more a placation or a greenwashing. I guess the question that I'm trying to ask is, are you a small fish in a big sea that you're hoping will be one of the ones that lead the way?
Yes, I think to extend that analogy further, we'd like to be the fish at the front of the shoal, turning the rest of the ocean green, but remaining a relatively small fish.
Yeah.
We don't have ambitions to take over the industry in terms of volume. But what we do have ambitions to do is show that it can be done and hopefully encourage people to do it better and or faster than they would have done otherwise.
Is being as green as you are, and I'd love for us to go over your credentials, which are wide and varied, are there cost savings to be found? Is it all cost, increased cost in general?
Well, initially it felt like it was very much increased cost, with a couple of notable exceptions. Our cooling pond is definitely a low-tech, relatively low-cost solution, which is great.
Okay.
The organic barley has always been high cost.
Yeah.
I don't think that will ever change. However, the biomass boiler, whilst it was very high cost in terms of capital up front, it's much more expensive piece of kit. And then it was quite high cost early on when oil prices were quite low, but suddenly the economics of that look quite different now.
Oh, okay.
Because oil prices have gone up, but timber prices haven't. So that is definitely a positive, but not. I'd say generally it's more expensive, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. But in the end, the right thing to be doing.
Completely.
Right.
Completely the right thing to be doing, partly because I can sleep at night. But, there's also other benefits to it. It's not just about cost, right? The organic barley brings this lovely texture to our whiskey. The biomass boiler is the right thing to do from all sorts of different angles, not just a kind of carbon emissions point of view, but it's our local source of fuel, and we are really remote, and anything else we brought in would be the wrong answer kind of locally.
Gotcha.
The road network can't deal with it. So there's lots of other benefits, I think, as well.
When I think about your boiler, and after I ask this question, I have a follow-up question. But when I think about your boiler and that it's biomass fuel, which is from timber, so you cut the wood, you replace it, you replant. Do you find that inhibits your general growth because you get to a point where you can cut only so much timber to where replanting, just the ratio becomes off?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay.
There's many more inhibitions to our growth than timber.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
For example, where we are,
Yeah.
the actual physical constraints of the building. Like,
Okay.
if we wanted to scale up production, we'd have to think about where we're going to put more washbacks.
Okay.
We would need to find more people. Quite hard to do. And actually, the amount of timber we take out of the forest that's next to the distillery is quite small. It seems... it's like 3 trailers a week. It's actually not a huge amount.
Okay. So my follow-up question, and this question isn't necessarily for me, it's a question that I heard the other night, and I think Sasha was talking about the boiler. And, someone who understands how distillation happens and how a distillery works, that word makes sense. but I heard someone say to their friend, "What's a boiler?"
Oh my God. That's
And
such a good question.
Right?
I mean, we use these words and it's like a boiler. I'm thinking about boiling water. Like, what?
Yeah.
And, I was in this position 10 years ago. Like, people would throw about mash tun, wash back, wash still. I'm like, what are these things?
Yeah. Is that English you're speaking? Or,
exactly.
right? So for our listeners who may not know what
a
that
boiler
is.
in its simplest sense is what converts an energy source into energy. So our energy source is timber and the output is steam. The steam goes from the boiler to the stills primarily, but also other parts of the process puts heat into those stills, and that's what allows distillation to happen.
Okay. And so using that fuel and then replanting, that gets you to your net zero carbon output.
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. For what's called scopes 1 and 2, which is what we control on site.
Okay.
So in one's carbon balance sheet, you have the carbon that your company emits from its own operation. So that would also include the electricity we use to run the pumps, but also to heat, like the office and all that sort of stuff.
Sure.
And then there's also scope 3, which is everything you buy in from your supply chain.
Okay.
Our bottles, being an easy example, we don't make them on the west coast of Scotland. So those are in our scope 3. They are not net zero because our partners are not using 100% renewable energy.
Okay.
So we still have work to do there.
Okay.
Which I think for every company is the really hard bit. You can choose to make that investment to go renewable on your own site.
Yeah.
But persuading your glass manufacturing partners to do so, indeed, there's actually a major kind of technological barrier to them doing that anyway. That's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah.
Is much harder.
Okay. If you don't mind, I want to talk about your production a little bit. So you mentioned it before, organic barley. It's expensive. Oh, you had said something. I'd love for our listeners to hear this. You said you had a conversation with Dr. Jim Swan about organic barley and your need to use organic barley, and his response was kind of perfect. Or the way you talked about that interaction was perfect.
Yeah, Jim was so great, but he had very firm views on how things should be done.
Yeah.
And when I told him that we were considering using organic barley, he said that as an expensive waste of time. And he was totally right on the expensive bit. But he had this interesting perception, and unfortunately I never got to ask him where it came from.
Okay.
But the organic barley was poor quality, i.e. that the actual grains that you got would be very different in size.
Okay.
And that causes an issue in the milling process. Because if you haven't got consistent grain size, you can't mill consistently. Which then in turn causes an issue in the mashing process.
Okay.
And you haven't got the right, basically, grist mix. So then you have a poor mash, you get a poor yield, you get poor flavour. And he saw that going all the way through.
Okay.
Now, I don't know where he got that perception from, because we have not had that issue with organic barley. But unfortunately, because he died just before we started production, he never got to see that actually it was fine.
Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, interesting. Yeah, that reminds me. I had a conversation with Matt Hoffman, who was previously of Westland.
Yeah.
And their idea with barley is they wanted to stop buying within the commodity market, which meant that they would have different varieties, different barley sizes, all of these things which were potential concerns.
Interesting.
So you found that sourcing and using the organic barley didn't give you any of the issues that
none.
he expected.
It didn't have any kind of physical processing issues.
Okay.
And the yield that we get from it is pretty bang on.
Is it?
Yeah. The yield that the farmers get from it is not. So on a per hectare basis, or acre basis, I don't know what, but per field basis, the yield of organic from any bit of soil is much lower than conventionally farmed barley.
Okay.
That's why it's more expensive, primarily, because a farmer earns less from every field if he's farming organically, because he's got less tonnage to sell.
Yeah.
But once it gets to the distillery, it's been great.
You're getting similar yield that you would from...
Just under 400 litres of pure alcohol a tonne.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right within that nice little window.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay, so here we are, organic barley, milling. we're getting to mashing. Can you talk about your mashing and your fermentation?
Yep. So I love all this, and I remember early doors when we were setting up, trying to explain to my board in particular kind of all the little levers that you can pull all the way through the production process. Yeah. And I actually wrote a board paper on it, which I must go back to at some point. But so yeah, mashing. The thing that's different about our mashing is we let it sit for an hour to stew, if you like.
Okay. So sit without water.
With water.
So
once we've added the water, but before we start recirculating to get a super clear wort, we let it sit for an hour. It's like cooking. You let a stew sit on the hob.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It lets those flavours develop. Then we recirculate for a super, super clear wort. That's very important.
Makes sense.
Starting point, because we're trying to get a relatively pure new make out at the end of the process. And then from a fermentation point of view, we use two yeasts, Anchor and Fermentis. We pitch them one after each other, and we have relatively long fermentation times, so a mixture of 68 and 114 hours. Okay. 3 out of 5 of our mashes a week are 114. The other 2 are. And
it's because of the weekend?
It is because of the weekend, exactly. And we can separate the distillate from those 2 mashes, fermentation times.
Yeah.
And because we've considered, should we do it all at 114? Should there be any? Yeah. And actually, so those 5 mashes, 2 at a shorter one, 3 at a longer one, all get combined at the end of the week into one set of cask fillings. So they get mixed together, if you like. There are no casks with the short ferment and the long ferment separately.
You haven't tried that experiment.
We've not tried. No, we've not tried it all the way into the casks. But what we did look at the distillate separately before it got mixed together.
Yeah.
To try and assess, should we adjust this ratio? Should we do more long, more short, whatever? And actually concluded that they have different characters and both play a role.
Okay.
The shorter ones, the longer ones have a lot more character, but the shorter ones add some of the brightness.
Interesting. And so with the yeast, because you pitch them separately, is there a waiting period between the 2, and what's the purpose for it, if so?
It's merely that they like different temperatures. So we just got to get the temperature right, basically. That's all.
That's it. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay. Some people come to this with this sort of really romantic view of why
exactly.
No, it's just this one likes 30 degrees Celsius and that one likes 28 or what. Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
I should have come up with some, it's when the ghosts of Nc'nean are lying in a row and
okay, so 68 up to 140 hours for
14,
114. Sorry, thank you. It's whatever's on the radio, which is really screwing me up here. And let's talk about your distillation process, because your flavor characteristics are quite light. So, is that slow distillation? Is it high cuts? What are you doing from that point of view?
All of those, and lots of copper contact. So we have lantern-shaped stills. So that's quite a lot of reflux, extra copper contact. Very slow distillation. We run it as slow as possible without the spirit not making it into the bowl in the spirit receiver.
Okay.
If you turn down the steam anymore, it's got too little power and it doesn't go into the bowl.
Okay.
But it's really as much of a trickle as we can make it. In particular on the spirit still, the wash stills, also slow but slightly less important.
Yeah. Okay.
So lots of copper contact, really slow distillation, and high cut points. Those are the key for the spirit recipe that is in all of the bottlings that we've released today.
Which implies you have a second or third spirit recipe.
We have a second recipe and experiments, which you could class as a third recipe.
Okay.
So the second recipe is a more traditional distilling recipe. The most important difference is that it has lower cut points.
Deeper into what you would normally consider the tails.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if you think about the head and the tails of our core recipe, the old recipe has longer on heads, slightly longer on heads,
okay,
a wider heart cut, and thus shorter on tails.
Okay. Okay.
So it starts slightly later, but it's also much wider.
Do you also go for a cloudier wort at that point for
good
old?
question. Originally, yes.
Okay.
We did. So we ditched the mashing rest time.
Yeah.
We didn't worry so much about a cloudier wort. We only used one of the yeasts.
Oh,
So all of those things changed.
sure.
However, we have since gone for a clean wort.
Okay.
Because we kind of felt like, I just think it makes a better whiskey all round.
Okay.
Even if
Yeah.
you're leaving it for 10 years, I think that's a good,
Yeah.
it's a good thing to aim
Yeah.
for. So now we go for a clear wort on all of
Okay.
our recipes.
Okay. Oh, that's cool. Okay. And then finally, before it goes into cask, I've always had this question in my head, and I'm not sure I've ever asked it of anybody, but when the spirit goes into the shell and tube, you've got shell and tube condensers.
Yeah.
You do not have worm tubs.
Correct.
Okay, I apologize to all of our listeners who want the worm tub episode. It's not happening here.
Not yet.
Are there things you could do within the shell and tube condensers to affect how that gas is being condensed to then affect your final spirit?
I think the most important thing that we are very focused on is to keep the temperature in the safe low.
Okay.
So sub 20 degrees is
Yep.
the magic number. And that is because the higher cut points capture the higher alcohols. By definition, those are literally the lighter compounds because they have evaporated earlier. They need less energy to turn into gas. Those are the nice fruity ones.
Yeah.
If the temperature is over 20 degrees, they can go back into vapor basically
Yeah.
too easily. And then whilst you've taken a high cut point, you're not actually capturing all of those compounds.
Okay.
So specifically what that means for the condenser is that it needs to be cool enough that it's cooling the spirit quickly.
Okay.
That's the key.
A quicker cooling.
Quicker
yeah.
cool and lower cool if possible.
Okay. Okay.
So the other thing that we do is because we have this quite natural cooling pond system, which we're not applying any like human derived cooling to, we don't have control over the temperature. So it's not like anyone's in the distillery setting our cooling water temperature to X in the mornings, which means that in the summer, because they're terribly balmy on the west coast of Scotland, we do sometimes have cooling water that creeps towards that 20-degree point.
Oh, okay.
So what we try and do is make our old recipe in the summer when the cooling water's hottest,
Okay.
where we don't care so much about capturing those higher alcohols because we've got that lower cut point.
There you go.
There you go.
I love it.
Work with nature.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about your core product and really your cask makeup, which is kind of unusual. I think a number of our listeners are educated enough. I would say dedicated whiskey drinkers are educated enough to know Dr. Jim Swan and know that he's instituted STR casks. And there's so many distilleries using STR casks that have worked with him. But you seem to use a higher proportion of STR within your mix than other distilleries. And so just with that in mind and knowing your recipe, I'm curious to how you got to the recipe of your organic single malt and what that process looked like.
Well, I guess it started with Jim when we were thinking about what we're going to fill into. Now, that doesn't necessarily determine the final output in the bottle, but it at least determines what's in your warehouse. And we agreed 7% would go into sherry, and the rest would be split 50-50 STR bourbon.
Okay.
And my understanding is that is it's actually sort of middling for a Jim Swan distillery. Some are filled into much more STR and some are filled into much less STR.
Ah, okay. Okay.
So anyway, that's what you fill into. You do that for 3 years.
Okay.
You wait and see what happens.
Yeah.
And then come 2020, when we were starting to think about bottling, we were starting to test blend ratios between those three cask types. And initially, we could quite easily rule out sherries because they weren't ready. And we went with quite a high proportion of STR, like I think it was 2/3 STR, 1/3 bourbon.
Okay.
That was what we launched with.
Yeah.
Roll on 2 years. The sherries had hit 5 years old. They were ready. and the bourbons and the STRs evolve at very different rates. So we found we had a kind of different profile of things to work with in the warehouse. So at that point, we adjusted our blend ratios again. So any batch of Nc'nean you now find with 2 letters and a number for the batch name is this new blend recipe, which is 55% STR cask, 43% bourbon and 2% sherry.
Okay.
So closer to what we have in the warehouse overall, but not spot on, because we found that the 7% sherry was too much.
And so I know Matt is your blender, but in the end, you founded this distillery. This was your baby. Did you have input into that, or he said, "Okay, Annabel, what are you most interested in? I'll try to design this."
Oh no! I mean, the first few blends Matt and I did together around my coffee table in my sitting room.
Oh, nice.
No, that was really important to me.
Yeah,
I think, and then at major changes, so we did the first few ones together, and then I would test to output, and then it got to the stage of Matt, you just do it, you're great.
Okay.
But then when we changed the blend makeup, we did that together, and Matt would go through it and say, "This is my recommendation, but here are the 6 I've been through. What do you think?" And for any of the kind of new seasonal releases, for example, which are completely different, I'll taste them as well.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny. We were talking about Matt the other day, and you'd mentioned that he came from bartending, came from the cocktail world. And my initial thought was, bartenders are masters at making cocktails, understanding the ratio to perfect an absolutely delicious drink. Like, that skill set has to be such had to have been such an asset to him moving into this position.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And, we didn't recruit him to be our blender. We recruited him to be our entree brand master, and he still does do that job partly.
Okay.
But we were kind of in a tricky position in 2020 because Jim would have been our blender had he still been alive.
Oh.
So that had been my plan. He was going to be our blender.
Yeah.
And, maybe we'd do some of it in-house, but he would definitely have been helping us choose the mix of cask that went into it and the proportions. I believe, at least this was the kind of, we didn't talk about it in detail because in 2017 this felt like a long time away. But we would have been sending him cask samples and he would have been putting it, basically doing Matt's job. So we had a bit of a hole in our lives, should we say, and I was really searching around for what the solution was because I didn't want to do it on my own, really.
Yeah, yeah.
And Matt was like, "Annabel, you and I can do this." So we did.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. So that's your organic product, and that will always be around.
Yeah.
Now, you'd mentioned that the general makeup of it is, basically 4, 5, 6-year-old whiskey.
Yeah.
Is that something that you plan on letting get older, or do you love where it's tasting now and you want to, leaning on that youth allows you to have a very specific flavor?
Yeah,
right?
It's a really good question. This actually came up in the Whiskey Club tasting we did on Tuesday night. And I got into the details of the matrix that's in my spreadsheet.
Okay.
And this spreadsheet has gone through so many iterations since 2012 when I first built it. But the matrix remains.
All right.
And it is basically different scenarios of exactly that.
Okay.
What percentage of what we made in each year goes into a bottle in what year?
Yeah.
And I think the answer is we don't know yet. I don't have any plans to over time transition everything to an average of 12 years old, for example. The average age of what we release will remain quite young, but it might remain at, say, an average of 8 years old. But that means we're bottling everything from 3 to 13 years old.
Yeah, sure.
Or it might remain at an average of 6, or there are lots of different scenarios within that matrix. And I think we don't know the full answer until we see where the stock gets to. But having said that, we are not in pursuit of age statements for age statements' sake.
No, and I'm so glad to hear that. They're not nonsense, but I don't think that age statements help in the way that they used to help people.
I agree. I mean, ultimately, age statements were designed to stop consumers being ripped off.
Yeah.
I feel like, all of that Scotch rules about you can only talk about the age of the youngest thing is so that someone didn't put one drop of 50-year-old into a bottle and call it a 50-year-old when all of it was 3-year-old. I feel like we're way beyond that in the world now.
Right, yeah.
Companies could not get away with doing that. And I feel like the regulation hasn't really kept up.
Yeah.
And I would prefer to be able to be much more transparent about what's in every single bottle, but we're not there yet.
Hey, just thinking back to this idea of aging up your whiskeys, you also have your second recipe to rely on to do some of that.
Absolutely.
Lifting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that second recipe is not going to be touched until it's a minimum of 10 years old.
Oh, okay.
Maybe longer. And
Okay.
we don't yet know what we'll do with it. It could provide an element. It could provide the next iteration of our blend recipe with an element of that older stock in there.
Yep.
Older stock, different recipe. Or we could release it as a specific product on its own with a different flavour profile that sits alongside Nc'nean Organic. We don't know.
Okay.
That'll be one of the blends that Matt and I sit down and think about and look at.
Okay. So then you've got your organic, and then you've got Quiet Rebels and Huntress.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to talk about the Quiet Rebels series and the Huntress as well.
Yeah. So Quiet Rebels comes out in October-ish time, and it is all about celebrating our people. So every year it is released in one of our team's name. So the one that's just come out is Quiet Rebels Gordon. Gordon's our distillery manager. He's been with us since the beginning. And the idea of these releases is that you get to choose or create a whiskey with Matt that is like what you love in whiskey.
Yeah.
So Matt sits down with the person, say a year in advance, tastes a whole load of whiskies, not just Nc'nean ones, a whole load, tries to figure out what they love, and then use finishing casks and the stock that we've already got available in the warehouse to create something as close to that as possible.
Okay.
So Quiet Rebels Gordon is STR and sherry heavy.
Yep.
It's also got some reef salt finish in it, which is a French sweet wine. The result is quite different to our core. Lovely kind of spice, much richer flavours.
Yeah.
Really delicious. And then Huntress is kind of slightly at the other end of the spectrum.
Okay.
So that's our really geeky releases.
Okay.
And I mentioned earlier the experiments we do. So we've been doing yeast experiments or yeast trials for basically since we started.
Okay.
So I've talked about the two yeasts we normally use, but we'll then introduce a third yeast that was not designed for distilling. We've used wine yeast, we've used beer yeasts, we've used rum yeasts to create different flavour profiles in that fermentation process.
And is that in addition to the two others? So you use 3 or are you swapping?
It depends.
Okay.
So we trial it all in buckets to begin with.
Okay.
And we will take a rum yeast and we will trial it in different proportions, but also sometimes only with anchor or sometimes, so it could be half anchor, half new yeast,
Okay.
or it could be a third anchor, a third fermentus, a third new yeast. It
Yeah.
just depends on the yeast and what tastes best. So what tastes best out of the bucket trial when we've effectively created wash.
Yeah.
We will taste all of those and also measure the alcohol produced and things, and then the ones that we like will scale up to the full
Yeah.
distillery.
I love that.
It's so cool. It's so fun.
Yeah.
And you get, you walk into the still house on the weeks we're doing, especially at cask filling time,
Yeah.
and it smells different. It'll smell like orange squash or
Yeah.
something
Oh, wow.
else. It's cool.
Yeah, it's funny. Here in the U.S., we talk about yeast quite a bit. You've got a lot of bourbon and rye producers that will use proprietary yeast strains,
Yes.
or they'll change them up. And I don't know that necessarily the origin of that. I have a theory that because a new charred bourbon barrel kind of focuses the flavors so tightly to American whiskey, that yeast allows you to sway a little bit here and there.
Makes total sense.
Where with single malt whiskey, you have the luxury to use a variety of casks.
Yeah.
Like you'd mentioned reef salt, right?
Yeah.
Which I want to talk about in a second. But so because you've had a variety of different casks to play with to create, just an expanse of flavors, yeast was always yield. We need to get alcohol from this wash, or from this wort. And so, what what drove you to these yeast experiments, knowing that you didn't necessarily need to be doing that
Yeah.
because you can use any cask you like?
Well, I think what's interesting is that the two things that I would add to your theory
Okay.
are one that, I mean, originally distilleries in Scotland did have proprietary yeasts back in the
Oh.
day.
Okay. Oh, I love this. Okay. Awesome.
But as they gradually got bought up, procurement departments would say, well, hang on, wouldn't it
okay.
be more efficient if we bought one yeast and squeezed the price on this one
Wow.
yeast across the
There
whole
you go.
company? And also we've looked at the yield across our multiple distilleries that we now own, and this one's the best, and da-da-da. So that was definitely part of it. And the other thing I would say is that, again, maybe in contrast to some American whiskies, if you're going to leave something in a cask for 20 years, the spirit overall, but within that the yeast has less impact on the final outcome of what
Sure.
is in your bottle.
Yeah, yeah.
So long aging, which was, something that probably came, really in the 80s when there was maybe a little bit too much Scotch, I think brought the focus away from spirit in general and put it onto casks.
Interesting.
Because really, if you're leaving it in a cask for 20 years,
Yeah.
the proportional influence of the spirit on the final product is
Yeah,
quite
the
small.
nuance is lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
Exactly. So you'd go to an awful lot of effort and then 20 years later see very little.
Okay.
If you could even find the records for
Yeah.
what was in the cask in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
first place.
Oh, wow.
So I think that's also part of the reason.
Okay.
But for me, I was, I drank a lot of craft beer. There's lots of amazing craft breweries in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
They would always talk about yeast. Ultimately, we are distillers of beer in making whiskey.
Yeah.
And I couldn't see why there was a difference.
Yeah.
I think the other factors, like the fact we're releasing a young whiskey and therefore we really can let the spirit shine through, want to let the spirit shine through,
Yeah.
also impacted it.
Yeah. Okay. Just really quickly for our listeners, when you said basically you're distillers of beer, for our American listeners, there's a number of distilleries that are making like hopped beers and distilling. You're not doing that.
No.
You're making a hopless beer, basically.
Correct.
Very traditional for single malt, but it's not beer.
It's not beer.
Yeah, okay.
You
Yeah.
wouldn't want to drink it.
Okay.
It's like 8%.
Yes.
And it is it's not sellable
Yes,
as
okay.
beer. But ultimately
Yes.
the process is very
It's the
similar.
same. Yeah, or very similar. Yeah. So really,
I would love to put hops in it, by the way, but it's not allowed.
we had one just separately that
We did.
that whiskey we had at Park Ave,
Yeah.
the sample.
Yeah, we did, exactly.
Wild, right?
I know, but not allowed in Scotland.
Nah. Is that true? It's not allowed?
You're not allowed anything but malted barley, yeast and water. That's the only
that's right.
ingredients. Nothing else. Oh, and some
Caramel
chemical
colour.
colouring. Let's not get started on that.
So the other day when I was doing the event with Manhattan Whiskey Club and Sasha, and Sasha was talking about the reef salt casks, and I was talking with someone who basically had a concern that distilleries, they're always putting whiskey into obvious casks. Can we have something other than bourbon or sherry, right? And when I think about it, there's a huge logistical component to it. There's a system in place. Here in the U.S., we cannot reuse a bourbon barrel and then call that product bourbon. So it makes sense that it goes to Scotland,
Yeah.
right? Sherry cask maturation appeals to a big number of whiskey drinkers, right?
Yeah.
It just makes sense, good economic sense. But then you find these oddities: Reeve salt, Sauterne, Pinot de Charente,
Tequila.
Tokai, right? How does that work? Do you go to brokers? Do you find a wine that you love and you say, "Oh, I like that. Oh, that's made by so and so. Let me give them a ring." Like how does that work?
In general, we always go through brokers.
Okay.
It's not completely... I can think of 3 cask types we have in our warehouse where we've got them direct from a distillery.
Yeah.
There's a rum distillery in the southwest of England. We've got some of their casks. Avelaine, Calvados, we've got some of their casks. And there's an amazing cognac distillery in France who we share a distributor, and we've got some of their casks. But in general, we would go to a broker. The logistics of that are much easier. But it goes both ways. We'll either go out looking for a cask type because we want it for some specific purpose.
Okay.
Like Tokai, I love Tokai. I wanted Tokai in my Quiet Rebels. Reeve Salt, I absolutely love the wine. There's a restaurant near me that serves a lot of it. I wanted to get some. But then, and there's actually a new cooperage that's opened up in Glasgow who does really, it's an amazing service. They've got really interesting casks. So also we will be inspired by what they offer us. So we might not have thought of something, but they'll say, we've got this. And we're like, that sounds cool.
I love that.
But we can also go and, if they're in Glasgow, you can go and nose them and stuff, which is amazing. So it works both ways.
Yeah. So here we are. We're talking about serious whiskey production.
Very serious.
Very serious. With just interesting usages of yeast and cask types, thoughtful blending to create a delicious whiskey. And then you look at your bottle, and there's a cocktail recipe on there. Let's talk about that.
Joshua. Is whiskey and soda a cocktail? That is the first question.
But well...
I'm joking. I mean, yes, maybe it's.
But
we don't need to get into
there's
the
a
semantics.
segment of people that would say, "Don't put anything near my single malt."
And they do.
Right?
The comments that we get on our Facebook posts, and people are appalled. But I would like people not to be appalled.
Yeah.
Because I think that is, bigger picture, one of the things that we would like to do is break down some of the rules that were put in place in the, let's call it the 80s, when single malt was kind of invented and we were all told, oh my God, you mustn't put anything in it. It's rubbish. It's complete rubbish.
Yeah.
And I think worse than that is it puts people off, and I think that's a great shame. Single malt shouldn't be for the few people who know what the 1980s rules were. It should be for everybody.
Yes.
And if that means that you want to add soda water, go for it. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say buy Nc'nean Organic and then add Coca-Cola to it, because I think that would be not a good use of your money. But soda water is amazing, right? It doesn't. It adds length. It adds bubbles. It adds refreshment.
Yeah.
And it adds a tiny bit of salt, which is like in cooking.
Yes.
It enhances it, and it allows you to drink it and appreciate it in a different way, drink it on a different occasion. What's not to love?
Yeah.
What's interesting though, soda water doesn't work with every whiskey. It works much better with some than others.
Oh, it's
the level of dilution. Some whiskies can stand it and some can't.
Oh,
And
interesting.
you know that even from adding drops of water to different whiskies,
Oh,
right?
for sure. Yeah.
Some of them it enhances, some of them they go a bit flabby.
Like sherry cask matured whiskeys, I find completely fall apart
Exactly.
when you add water.
Exactly.
Oh, interesting.
So I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it with every whiskey,
Yeah.
but there are. But I mean, I would recommend drinking every whiskey however the hell you like.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a suggestion on the side of the bottle. It's also trying to say, don't be too beholden to the rules.
Yeah. Yeah, it's when I saw that, I loved it because I'm the same way. It's your bottle.
Yeah.
You've paid the money to get it. Do with it what you'd like.
And actually, that's what we say above the whiskey and soda recipe. It says drink it ... as you like.
There you go.
Most
right?
important. Yeah.
You don't necessarily need to. You shouldn't be so precious. About it. Well, maybe there's some bottlings out there where you want to be, right? I can think of a few, but my point is, I think there will be a segment of people that would say, that's not for me.
Yeah.
And that's okay, because whiskey drinkers are not a monolith, and you'll have another segment of people that may say, oh, that's interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also, we've always wanted to make a whiskey that is great neat.
Yeah.
But everyone knows that already.
Yeah.
We don't need to put that on the side of the bottle. You don't need to tell people you can drink single malt neat. That's the default. So that's also why we wanted to put whiskey and soda on the side of the bottles and add anything. If you just say pour this into a glass and drink it. But I also think, I think there's something about, it's quite a versatile drink. You know, even if you love it neat, I love it neat, but I also drink whiskey and sodas. Yeah. It's not binary. You don't have to only be a whiskey and soda drinker or only a whiskey neat drinker.
Yeah. When you first started selling whiskey, did you have an idea of what the Nc'nean consumer looked like? And as you went along, were you surprised that it stayed the same, was different? Who's...
Well, it's a tricky one to answer because we launched at a very weird time, right in the middle of COVID.
COVID? Never heard of it.
What was that?
Oh, that's where two people watch a
familiar.
video together. It's like a COVID. Got it.
I mean, I've always wanted Nc'nean to be enjoyed by people who love whiskey, but also maybe open the door to people who thought whiskey wasn't for them.
Yeah, sure.
I think some of the specificities of what happened when we launched and we auctioned our first 10 bottles, and the first one went for a lot of money, got the whiskey audience very interested in what we were doing. So that was definitely our kind of main consumer to begin with. And also getting new people into something that I think is maybe not for them is a long-term game anyway. It's not going to happen overnight. So I don't think I'm surprised. I think that kind of newer audience we're still chipping away at, and it's something we'll be doing for a long time.
I love that. Still forging your own path.
Yeah,
I love
exactly.
that. The last question that I have for you, here you are, you launched August 2020. Is that when... That's not when your whiskey first turned 3 years of
March
age.
2020.
March 2020.
2020, yeah. So it was three and a half-ish.
3.5 years old. Here we are, 2024. You're almost 5 years into your launch.
How crazy is that?
What does the next 5 years look like? What has you excited about Nc'nean? As we get closer, this is fucking scary. As we get closer to 2030, what has you excited?
2030. Oh my God, it's so futuristic. We're all going to be robots by
We're
then.
all going to be robots. Oh my gosh.
What am I excited about? I think it's really cool seeing it in different markets. We've only been in the US 6 months, and in some states within the US we're not even in yet, and some we're just launching. I really find that fascinating, the different reactions that you get in different countries. So I would love, it still feels like we're really early in our journey, and ultimately I just want more people to hear about what we're doing and taste what we're doing. And I think in the next 5 years that is our focus. Just keep spreading the word,
plugging
basically.
away. Yeah. Okay.
And obviously there's loads of cool liquid stuff that I'm excited about as well. Different casks that we've got in the warehouse. All those 3 casks I just mentioned, the rum, the Calvados, and the cognac we haven't released yet. There's all sorts of other ones we've got in the warehouse.
Calvados. Ooh.
It's tricky though, because it's quite tricky, Calvados. We found it a bit tricky anyway.
Because it can be so imposing on the whiskey?
Yeah, so imposing. And it's just taken longer than we might have expected to get to a good place. But one of them is nearly there now, which is exciting.
All right.
And also continuing to do the kind of, the spirit experimentation and things that we've talked about. And then bigger picture, we've still got lots of work to do on sustainability. We're pretty in a good place about what we control, but working with our farmers to make that barley even more sustainable, working with our other bits of our supply chain to try and improve that is still a major focus for us.
I meant to ask this before. Usually that question I asked you is my last one, but I meant to ask you this before because you are net carbon neutral, right? You are organic certified, but you're also a B Corp.
Yes.
Can you talk about that real quickly and what it means to be B Corp certified and maybe what that does for you from a business standpoint?
Yeah, so B Corp certification it's a certification like any other. You have to meet a whole range of criteria. The point of B Corp is to kind of use business as a force for good, put people, planet and profit on an equal footing. So it's not just about profit, and that goes as far as being written into our legal documents that govern the company, that the board or the directors have to consider all of those things in any decision making, whereas traditionally in a company you would just be thinking about profit. And I would say the process of certifying is a very positive one. It helps you make improvements to the company. Some are actually quite easy to do and you've just not thought of, and it prompts you to do it.
Okay.
And then once you've certified, it's also a process of continuous improvement and trying to make things better every year.
Okay.
You recertify every 3 years. I think beyond that, you become part of a community, which is pretty cool.
Okay.
And that's across obviously multiple sectors. And it encourages great collaborations and a great sense of support and purpose and trying to make the world a bit of a better place, which has been fantastic.
I like that.
It's also, I think, in a world where there's lots of marketing messages and lots of noise around these things, it's becoming, especially in the US and the UK, a better recognised stamp that means something to consumers, which is helpful from a communication point of view.
Yeah, right. It's, similar to a kosher certification.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
It's a guide. It guides people. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Well, there you go. Let's end on making the world a better place
Exactly.
while drinking delicious whiskey.
One whiskey at a time.
One whiskey at a time. Cheers, Annabel.
Thanks,
Appreciate it.
Joshua.
That was a very good conversation and very good to hear so much of this direct from Annabel. And the way you and I were talking going into that interview was about sustainable practices are essential. And it's wonderful looking around the modern Scotch whisky industry and seeing what Bruichladdich are doing and Ardnamurchan and Lag and Gordon Bruce at Knockdhu and even through our own podcast and the conversations we have been having with producers and farmers and this is an old Scottish expression here. I really feel like we're starting to sing from the same page of the hymn book, which is really nice. And again, right, we're looking around the industry with our own eyeballs, and we're seeing points of agreement, points of commonality. But in listening to Annabel championing a distillery that is earth-focused and whiskey-focused, but what a lovely presentation of that.
Yeah.
And what a way to go from the smallest of the small, ballpark 100,000 litres of production a year, to the largest of the largest. I'm thinking Diageo and Johnny Walker.
Yep.
And everyone in between. We're looking at packaging. We're looking at what's reusable. We're looking at what part of the package we could skip. Like the fact that is now an active conversation is wonderful.
Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful. I know you didn't go into it in your conversation, but the use of peat, right? Which I know at Nc'nean, they're not making a peated spirit. Here we are, and again, props to Mike Billett in his book and Anna's recommendation. But what are we doing with peat? How are we using peat? That's a conversation that we're having now. So I'm really excited that we continue to have these conversations. I'm excited that our listeners are actively listening to these conversations. Their feedback is excellent. And so I really feel, we're a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and not every day feels like we're winning. And the thought that distillation, distillers, distilleries are doing their best in a lot of cases is very exciting.
It is exciting. And listen, you're living in America now, so I'd say you're winning every day of your goddamn life. But
looks out window, pours dram.
But yeah, again, Nc'nean aren't the only people shouting about it or doing things. I love that they lead with it, and I thought that was. I think it's commendable. And the other thing that I like too, and this may be controversial, Jason.
Oh.
I love that their blender, Matt, did not come from a traditional whiskey blending background or went through the typical sort of apprenticeship that many do. And I'm not knocking that one bit. I love Matt's approach to whiskey blending because it's coming from the cocktail world. And it takes talent to make a damn good cocktail. And I'm not saying making a cocktail is harder than making a single malt at all. But when we talk about blenders, right, we talk about the difference between, say, a James Saxon or a John Glazer compared to someone who blends single malt, like a Richard Patterson or something like that. Someone who blends single malt, they have one ingredient they're working with, granted different ages, different cask types, where a blender who's working with multiple distilleries and multiple cask types, as well as a cocktail, someone who's producing a cocktail is working with different spirit styles and then different modifiers. You just have to come at it from the standpoint of, okay, this is going to be complex. This could be very difficult, but I'm gonna go at it and I'm gonna make it happen. If you truncate the number of components you have to single malt whiskey from a single distillery, from a smaller number of cask styles, you could see where that expertise then focused on single malt could be very useful. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I know it's always dangerous to quote people from online, but it has been interesting watching the rise of a non-traditional distillery in the form of Nc'nean and then this non-traditional role with Matt here. And for some people, if you want to knock Nc'nean, it's getting knocked as a cocktail ingredient, right? It's a lighter Highland malt style.
Yeah.
And Highland malt traditionally, there's that word again, like how did we traditionally watch TV? How did we traditionally piss off the kids? Traditionally, Highland malt meant a particular thing. But then I think about you and your originalist love affair with Glenmorangie, right? Glenmorangie's a lighter spirit.
Yeah.
Like tall swan neck stills, high reflux.
Great cocktail ingredient.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But like I don't recall people knocking Glenmorangie for being a cocktail ingredient.
Yeah,
so
well, I mean,
you do?
No, I don't.
No.
I think, we're dealing with a different world. Glenmorangie sort of coming back again as a popular distillery happened before the internet became as toxic as it is now. Nc'nean is growing up in that toxic internet environment.
Right.
And what is the other thing that they're doing? They're looking to be a very inclusive company. You don't love whiskey? Awesome. Maybe you'd like a whiskey cocktail. And then find out that you love whiskey. I read a number of the same things that you do on the internet. Unfortunately, I think I should read less on the internet than I do currently. But the complaint is, like you were saying, that it's a cocktail ingredient, and it's just going to bring in the quote unquote party girls. Like, I love cocktails as well. I love going out to bars and having a good time and singing karaoke, and I'm not called a party boy. You know what I mean? Like, you can live different lives and enjoy different things. Certain things for various reasons, and it just seems like a toxic way to be talking about a distillery and their spirit who's only trying to bring in more people into the whiskey conversation, which I think is what we all want, right? We want more people in the whiskey conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, if we're over 140 Scottish distilleries, it would be a real shame if they were all the same, right? We've talked about that, the value of difference. You know,
Yeah.
We've talked about consistency, right? We've talked about independent bottling of single cask, right? This is a gigantic whiskey industry tent. And if we can't find room for newcomers who are on their own journey and finding distilleries that some people aren't partial to the spirit, like, what have we done, man?
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. Yep.
Open the tent, bring people in. So, yeah, and we say this about every single distillery. If it's not for you, move on.
Move on. Yeah.
Find one that is for you. What is it we say? Don't yuck someone's yum. Right, that's what we say in our house to try and
yeah.
avoid being judgmental. Right?
We
Don't
say
yuck someone's yum.
Don't harsh my mellow. Don't harsh my mellow.
Right? Let's like the things that we like and celebrate those things we like and leave people to enjoy things that aren't for us.
You and I, Jason, have a little bit to talk about, or maybe it's a lot of bit to talk about. Do we have a lot or a little? Like, should we be waking the paper boy, or can he take a little napsy nap?
Absolutely. We should crunch the numbers while he's getting his first cup of coffee in him. Maybe his first cigarette of the day. He comes from a different era
Crunch the numbers?
on how long it's going to be.
Oh, okay.
Just bouncing off your intro. Just listening to the words you're saying and responding to them. Well, I feel like one of us should.
Yeah, I was not making that connection at all. Well, because I asked, do we have a lot to talk about or a little? Crunch the numbers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe you should have your first cup of coffee, maybe a cigarette, see how it treats you.
Fucking hell.
I think the Paperboy's had time for 2 cigarettes now.
Extra, extra! Read all about it. Life story of Playboy Penny. Extra, extra! Extra, extra! Read all about it. Me and that Playboy and
The first thing that I want to bring up in our little news bit here is, here we are, April 3rd, and last time I checked, we still had a few of our Thornton Kosher for Passover rums available on our website, and Passover this year comes a bit later. It's in the 3rd week of April, but we have a new shipper in place who turns things around lickety split. You'd gotten some really high praise from some nation members about the new shipping, haven't you?
Yeah, the truth of the matter in the US is we've adopted an entirely new system. And so the entire endeavor operates differently than it has traditionally. And the response from nation members has been fantastic. There are additional options on the website in terms of shipping. We still have our $15 flat rate shipping fee, but we've been asked for the better part of a dozen years if we offer expedited shipping. Now we do. So if you are someone who lives in expedited shipping waters, fill your boots, go bananas. But yes, if you are listening to this today, you're still interested in getting that Thornton on your Passover Seder table, that can absolutely happen. So please go to the website. The other thing I will add, I think I've been saying this the entire time, if you do not have a Passover Seder table and you have backyard gatherings with friends that involve fun cocktails, we've been talking about cocktails in today's episode. Go ahead, grab some Thornton. It is excellent, absolutely excellent. And our conversation last week with Ari Clafter was so much fun, and we learned so much from talking to him that I recommend people listening to this podcast go onto the YouTubes. You will find that Ari Clafter conversation.
Yeah, so I'd been playing around with the liquid quite a lot. You know me, I love a good daiquiri. We shared our recipe for our Dainu daiquiri, and I've made a few of those. Made a couple for Haida as well. But, and a rum Negroni. Holy crap, does it make for a great rum Negroni. But just as a sipper in and of itself, I want to be kind of clear with folk. We understand this is a $90 bottle, and you may not want to be cocktailing with $90 liquid. That's cool. What a phenomenal drinker in and of itself. So grab them while you can, especially if you do celebrate Passover. You're going to want it there for your Seder and for any celebrations across those 8 days of the holiday.
I'm going to say this, Joshua. My privilege is showing, because until you made that comment a moment ago, I honestly think nothing of using a $90 ingredient in a cocktail.
Oh, really?
And it's not because I go to sleep on mountains of cash, but it's from talking to bartenders, cocktail makers, mixologists, if you dare to say that word 3 times.
And a mustachioed man with neck tattoos and suspenders and a vest shows up with old-timey music and a typewriter.
But with a damn good old-fashioned in his hand, so it's kind of worth it. It's what's the takeaway? You put good ingredients in, you get good cocktail out. If I was going to pour an ounce into a glass and sit and quietly sip on it, I would want a good quality spirit. If I'm going to take an ounce and put it into a cocktail, I want a good quality spirit. So, I will say, once we go over 100, it's maybe a different proposition. but honestly, double digits, if I've got it in my house, I really don't mind experimenting with it. And I do want to reiterate, it's not because I'm going to sleep on mountains of money. I'm not Schmaug, right, from J.R.R. Tolkien, right? I'm not going to sleep on mountains of gold and protecting them with fire coming out my mouth. Although in the morning, my wife tells me I do have aromas coming out my mouth that are not pleasant.
Yeah, I'll agree with her.
Brimstone and such.
What's
she
that?
says. Yeah, I've woken up next to you many a time, Joshua. You have made the exact same comment as my wife. To be fair. So I don't want to be show-offy about it, because I certainly am not. But good ingredients in gets good cocktail out.
Yep. It really is as simple as that. Now you're not wrong. I mean, that's what I do with all of my 35-year-old Port Ellen. I just,
That's the only way to drink them.
Really, just like with a bit of Coke.
A
cola.
I don't drink highballs, but when I do, it must include 35-year-old Port Ellen.
Oh, have you ever done one with that 1919 Springbank? Oh my gosh, killer highball.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I only did it the once and I screwed it up. I used far too much ice and completely ruined it. Listen, very, very quickly, we're in the news segment.
Yeah.
Congratulations to Port Ellen reopening their doors. So
There you go.
Mazel.
Yep, mazel.
Since we're making humor about silly cocktails and ruining old spirits, check us out. We're so silly. Silly Billies.
So here we are, we're in April, being silly billies in April. But we also have some news regarding some April releases for our website. Do you want to detail some of that out for the listeners?
Absolutely. So while we will continue to draw attention to the Ardnamurchan and the Ardmore that remain on the website, selling well, people are opening them, the reviews coming back are spectacular.
Yep.
Very, very happy with those. We are going to do a little bit of globe hopping in the month of April. And we're going to bring in a teenage rum. I was going to name from where, but it's going to give the game away. And I want to leave people in suspense for a modicum of time.
There you go.
We're going to bring in a 4-year-old rye from down there.
Oh, from down there. Yeah. Okay.
And
You may have given that one away.
and a teenage Highland Scotch. I like leaving it there.
Does this teenage Highland Scotch have any smoke to it?
It might.
Okay.
It might. But how fun is that? How fun is a teenage rum, a teenage Highland malt, and a nice 4-year-old rye?
Well, I'll tell you, if they were humans, they'd make a reality TV show about teenagers with a 4-year-old. But these are spirits. Isn't that a show? It's just something like I'm a Teenage Mom or something like that.
Oh yeah. Oof. There's an image.
And that's why, Jason, we're in the right business. We're talking about whiskey. We're talking about rum. Yeah, this is exciting. I like that. I like that we're able to offer different spirit types to people, and in all three cases, we're revisiting distilleries we've worked with before, but we're presenting the whiskeys in manners we hadn't previously. So.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, that's nicely. Yeah, that's a very good way to think about it. I like that a lot. Yeah, and again, I was thinking about this before we hit record in today's episode. Sitting here in America, obviously, our ROW continues to operate. We would have Jess on, but during today's recording, she is on vacation, and bless her for being on vacation. I hope she has got her shoes and socks off, and she is walking on a warm sandy beach somewhere. All of this is great humor because I know where she is and she knows where she is, and that is not a reality.
She's got double socks on.
But we do promise next episode we'll have Jess in this news segment talking about global release strategy.
Here you go.
But you and I, sitting here in the US, and especially with the online releases, we were sitting quietly for a few months. We brought in what was needed for OND. We then started working on what would be needed once the calendar turned January, February, March. Mm-hmm. And March saw the launch of our Ardmore, Ardnamurchan and Thornton K4P rum. Now April, products are on the website, orders can be made. Like I feel like we're coming out of hibernation as we're sitting here in the spring of the year, and the festivals are starting up and the tastings are starting up, and we've got things to show off and things to pour and reviews coming in from nation members. Like, this feels good. This feels like a new beginning, which every spring is.
Every spring is, and I like what you said, this coming out of hibernation. It's not just us and the bottles we're releasing, but like you had said earlier when we were talking about the rum, the weather's starting to get warmer. People are going to be enjoying their backyards and parties and having reasons to be sharing drinks with friends, and so, you know, us getting on this schedule of releasing 3 bottles per month, you know, hopefully helps that. You know, we are pretty much out of COVID era living, but man, those 2.5 years of COVID era was real tough. I know it was tough for me, and being able to spend time with people and share drinks and make cocktails and just being with people, I live for that, and that's 2024 is going to be that. So hopefully, I know our bottles are going to help me. Hopefully our bottles will help others as well.
Hashtag, please drink the entire bottle responsibly while sharing with good friends.
And that's how you get to drinking the whole bottle. You share it with friends.
Yeah, I love it when I encounter nation members out in the wild and they're throwing back at me as they're taking a sip of something. Now that is a pull the cork on a Friday and recycle the bottle on a Monday kind of dram. I'm like, yes. Hashtag, please recycle responsibly.
All right. I think that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, but I think that's all we have for this week's news. Yeah.
This episode's news,
This
indeed.
episode's news. We had an email come in from Nick Frangipane. And
Frangipane.
Frangipane, Barbary 4. And we brought it up, I think it was in the last episode, Jason? A couple episodes ago?
So we featured Nick's mailbag email in the mailbag episode.
Okay.
And in his email, he'd made a claim about Kilchoman having a 3.5 hour still run that seemed outside of the industry norm, which he had taken to be around 6 hours average.
Yeah. Yep.
And in the mailbag episode, we'd kind of not quite taken him to task. We're not taking to task kind of people.
No.
But we had said, that's a strange number. That doesn't seem to sit. I wonder if Nick could show his workings.
Yeah.
And bless him, bless his little heart, he sent in an email with his workings. And he sent it in February, and here we are, quoting him in the April 3rd episode. So we've let him stew a little bit, but we'll give him his due today. He says, "Thank you so much for reading my letter and discussing my questions. I really appreciate it. I didn't realize how long-winded I was until I heard it on the air. A side effect of being in academia, I suppose." And then says, "As a recovering academic, I'm sure you remember, Jason." And I would say, as a recovering co-host of this podcast, I remember. You all joked about me sharing. I'm having a hard time reading this. I gotta bigify the text here. And yes, it is a saved PDF before anybody writes in to ask the question. You all joked about me sharing my source for Kilchoman's 3.5 hour distillation, and I'm happy to oblige. It actually came from Kilchoman's own website. On the tour page, they describe each stage of the tour for visitors, and under the distillation heading, the following phrase appears. Each distillation lasts around 3.5 hours, during which the production team makes sure only the heart of the spirit ends up being sealed into our selected casks. And then, like a good academic, he includes the source, and he then concludes by saying, perhaps they were just talking about the time in the spirit still, or perhaps the very small stills need less time. Perhaps the tour department had a miscommunication with the distillers. We may never know. Thanks again, Nick. So, we have followed this link and we have looked over the verbiage used here. And it very much seems to be the case that the spirit run is being quoted as a 3.5 hour process. Right. They don't quote the wash run on the tour page, but depending where you look, depending on the volume of your still, depending on, again, how quickly you're running it, we have seen wash still runs quoted in the 4 to 7 hours territory. Yep. So even if you kind of came down to the short end of that and you went with 4, you would have a 7.5 hour runtime, right, at Kilchoman that fits in with the industry norm that Nick was quoting in his original mailbag episode as well. Yeah. So I don't think anything out of the ordinary is happening here. I don't think there's been a miscommunication between a distilling side of house and a touring side of house. I think it's just how those numbers have been separated and then presented to the public.
So let me just, for those who may not have listened to the mailbag episode and are sort of coming into this, I know.
Say what? Oh my gosh!
I know.
Okay, those vapors are coming on real strong, real strong.
You know, if you're coming into this conversation not necessarily grasping what Jason is laying out here for you, the question was around the overall length of distillation. When you read the Kilchoman website, it would appear as if they're talking about the overall distillation time being 3.5 hours. But Scotch whiskey is typically a double distilled product, right? You make a wash, you distill that wash, and then spirit comes off that still. Then you take that spirit and you redistill it in your spirit still. So what Jason is talking about here is, yes, there is 3.5 hours of distillation, but that is specifically on the spirit still, the secondary still, where the distillation on the first still, which is the wash still, typically tends to be around 4-ish hours. So if you add those together, the overall distillation time would be around 7-ish hours, and that could, plus or minus depending on the distillery, depending on the capacity of the stills. So this is why when Nick's email first came in and we only saw 3.5 hours, it just seemed like, wait a second, that's about half the normal time.
Distillation. Something felt like it was missing.
Yeah. So just keeping everything up. And listen, I actually reached out to James Wills, and he came back to me with some further explanation on their own processes.
Perfect.
And he had said distillation runs are just under 4 hours.
There you go.
Of which we are on spirit for 1 hour and 20 minutes. The stills run simultaneously, but I guess it would be accurate to say the two distillations take 7 to 8 hours, and that's the wash run plus the spirits run. So there you go. So you're looking at
wonderful
7 to 8 hours overall. So that's perfect. So James, thank you so much for cluing us in on that. That's really great.
Yeah, really nice when you can drop a note, get a response, get questions answered. And so could you just reiterate there the spirit run? So the heart cut at Kilchoman, James Wills is saying, is 1 hour and 20 minutes?
Hour and 20 minutes, yeah. So, I mean, that's a really good thing to
minutes.
point out, right? I mean, when you're looking at a spirit run, especially on the spirit still, the second still, where you're doing your heads, hearts, and tails cut, or your 4 shots, hearts, and feints cut, the hearts cut, the spirit that you want to put in cask, is around 1 hour and 20 minutes of spirit run of that 3.5 hours overall. So right, of
that 8 hours.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see why it can be kind of confusing. There's a lot of ins and outs and what have yous.
But again, right, as a distiller, you're putting in an 8-hour workday, and you're getting spirit for 1 hour and 20 minutes of that 8-hour workday that you can put into cask and sell. Like that's a tough proposition, isn't it?
Oh my
like,
God,
how do you make £1 million in the whiskey industry? Start with 2 million.
We're gonna run this for 8 hours, but only 1 hour and 20 minutes of it is usable. That's what, right? And this is does that talk to the difficulties in gaining efficiency in production?
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there you go.
100%.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. That's a good episode. I like the way this all ties together today. Yeah. Even the royal family and non-traditional ways of watching TV fits with Nc'nean, fits with Nick's message here about Kilchoman Spirit Run.
Can we call him Nc'nean? Nc'nean? No, we can't do that. Nah, he's Frangipane.
You have tied so many threads together. You have tied your own shoelaces together, and you have fallen flat on your face.
And you ask me why I'm tripping all the time.
Hey!
Again, huge thanks to Annabel Thomas for coming on the podcast, and you know,
Absolutely, been a long time coming.
what was kind of cool about this interview was this was my time with Annabel was my last sort of big thing with Impacts and my time at Impacts. I stayed around to ensure I can bring Annabel around and make sure that her time here, along with her coworker Sasha, was the best it could be. And spending time with her, spending time with Sasha was fantastic. And just getting this hour or so over a cup of coffee was just time well spent. So hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully the listeners enjoyed it. I know Annabel and I enjoyed the conversation. She told me she enjoyed it, so I have to assume she's truthin'. Well, I raise my... I'm not drinking, Jason. I just have a tea mug. I'm going to raise my tea mug to you.
I've got a pair of bifocal spectacles and my AirPods case.
Wonder Twin Powers, activate!